Alright, so we're going to make an eye, and what I have open right now is a file where an eye has already been created. And basically, it's very simple, as you can see, as far as what we have as far as geometry. We have basically just two surfaces. And so we're going to build one from scratch so you can sort of see why we have the two surfaces and how the shaders are set up and how lighting is set up and whatnot. So that in the end, here's just a render of this eye. We can make sure that things like the iris, the pupil, the transparency, the refraction that happens inside here, and then the body of the eye that has veins, bump maps, specular maps, and so forth. Just how to sort of set all that up. And we're going to be doing that using mental ray and ray tracing. And so basically the first thing that we need to be clear on before we make an eye is what eyes look like. And so we can see in this file that we've got a little bit of a bulge at the front of the eye. And also you can notice, I'll just point it out, is we do see some streaking textures here, which I don't really worry about because you're never going to see that part of the eye because the eyelid stops, around here as far as the opening of the eye. So that's something that's easy to fix if you think you're going to need to have an eyeball out by itself. But for this example, we don't need to worry about that so much. So inside here, this little bulge is the corneal bulge, meaning the transparent part of the eye right here is called the cornea. And then the colored part is called the iris. And then the opening inside there, which is actually a hole where the light goes in to the retina inside the eyeball, that is the pupil. So we've got the pupil, the iris, and the corneal bulge, and then just the body of the eye. And so we have that in this model. You'll see that if I just go and open up, Photoshop for a second, and just go and grab, let's say, a diagram. And so this is just something that, without even doing it that way, just so you can see how easy it is to find this stuff, I'm just going to launch a browser. And let's say we just do a image search, and we do an image search for something like, an eye diagram. You'll immediately get stuff popping up like this. And so this is useful before you get started on eyes, just to understand how they are constructed. And so with a lot of these diagrams, they're not necessarily done to scale correctly. So like very often the corneal bulge or the iris will be too big or too small. So that's something you're going to have to, not necessarily rely completely on these diagrams for. But if we just take a look at any one of these, so let's say we go and grab one that looks relatively clear to read. And so, they're all kind of fine, but let's say we take a look at this one. So you can see again, we've got the corneal bulge right there, which is transparent. And so, but the thing is, as a sort of transparent material, it tends to bend light. And so you'll notice that in this artist rendering, the iris, which is the colored part, looks kind of flat when you're looking at it from the side, but in reality, this little corneal bulge is going to bend the light, and so this iris isn't going to look flat like this. It would actually sort of bulge out just because of refraction. So we need to deal with this bulge, we need to make it transparent, and we need to have an iris. And then you can see that the pupil there is really just an opening. So the iris just sort of has a opening where light passes through onto the back of the eyeball or the retina where it gets exposed to light. And then also directly behind the opening or the pupil you can see is where the lens is. And so this is what allows us to sort of focus light. And so we just need to deal with obviously modeling a sphere that has a little bit of a bulge, modeling an iris shape, and then texturing and doing shaders. So it is fairly straightforward. And so once you get to texturing and shaders, obviously you're going to want to be looking at photographs of eyes. And so if I go back and Google a little bit, instead of doing an eye diagram, I just do an image search for eye, then you're going to start to see a lot of good pictures that you can use as reference for the shape of eyes as well as texturing to get some good irises. Because you can obviously paint your textures by hand for things like veins or irises. Let's take a look at this picture. So inside here you can see that, this is a nice front view picture of an eye that I found relatively quickly. And the nice thing about this picture is that there's a little specular highlight, a little reflection right there of the light source that's illuminating this eye. But it's right in the middle of the pupil. And obviously you're going to go and paint this pupil area black when you do your texturing. But this area right here is kind of perfect for texturing because there's no highlights that we would have to clone out or erase out. And then here you can see we have some, source material we could use for veins and also get an idea of color because you can see that there are actually different colors inside an eye, meaning it's not just white. And so you can see it's a little more yellow there, a little white there, a little bluish or purplish on the sides. So you really just need to look at pictures like this. And a great website to get these kind of pictures aside from using Google image search, is a site that isn't free. You have to pay for it, but it's definitely worth it, which is 3D.sk, so 3DSK. And this is just sort of a artist reference site, so photo reference, but there's a lot of pictures inside here, and they are incredibly useful as far as reference and also for texturing. And so inside here, basically, you can go in and search based on body types. When you were just looking for something like eyes, you're going to find a lot of them. So I highly recommend subscribing to this site. You can see it's super cheap. And if I go in Photoshop, I'm a member of that site, and so I've, got, as we can see inside here, a whole sort of 3DSK folder where I've grabbed stuff from the site. And in here, I took the time to go through the men and the women that I downloaded and sort of grab just their eyes. And so I have a directory here that if I turn the thumbnails on, so I just went and cropped in on a lot of pictures, and I also have some pictures I grabbed on Google, just some different eye references. So I've got, pictures of eyes looking to the sides, which are useful for getting the veins for texturing. And then I also have lots of pictures of eyes from the front, which are useful for getting your irises. And if we look at some of these pictures, you can see this is only at 33% right now. And so if I zoom into this, you can see it's, a very high-res picture. But you can clearly see that this picture, for example, while it's a good reference, is not really good for texturing your iris because you've got these huge reflections inside here of the lights that were illuminating this eye. And you'd have to go and paint those out. And so this one, while it's nice reference and is nice and high-res, if we go back into my little eye directory inside here, and look around, you'll see there also will be textures or photos of eyes, like this one, for example, or this one, that don't really have big highlights on them. And so if we take a look at this one, this is also nice and high res. And so this is one I grabbed off Google from somewhere. But this is not much painting work that we'd have to do as far as painting that out. And so that's actually relatively simple. So, and this iris, now that I'm looking at it, that image that I had up in Maya, this is the iris that I use for texturing that. So we've got some reference, but the first thing we need to do is start with modeling. And so if we go back to something like a diagram, so these are just some diagrams I got off Google. This is a little side view. And so you could just use this obviously as a template for modeling when you get into Maya and just import this as an image plane into, let's say, a side view. But the thing that you'll find with this diagram, for example, is while it looks fairly normal, the size of that bulge and the size of the iris right there is actually way bigger than a human's iris is. And so a human's iris is not, this tall compared to the height of the eye. A human iris is more like the size of this lens right here. And so, because you'll find that if you go and made this eye, the way this image plane would be, you'd find that when you tried to stick it into an eyelid on a human head, that your iris would just be huge. Because if you look at photos, so let's go and grab a photo of somebody's eye inside here. You can see inside here that irises usually fit, inside the eyelids. And so with most of these pictures, you'll find that the bottom of the iris when somebody's looking forward is usually touching the bottom eyelid. And then the top of the iris is usually covered with somebody who's not opening their eye really wide. So if we look in here, all these people are kind of opening their eye rather wide, but here's a good example, where usually the bottom of the iris is kind of near or touching the bottom eyelid, and then the top of it gets obscured. But inside here, you can see that if you opened a picture like this, and we sort of zoom out a little bit to give ourselves a little more room, that if I went in and tried to figure out, well, where is the actual, if I go to the center here, hold down Shift and Alt so that it sort of makes a spherical marquee drag from where I clicked, you would look at this and be like, well, my eyeball shape is probably, around this size, as far as the size of the eyeball. And then if we go and took that and let's say make a new layer, and let's go and stroke that. So let's say we'll stroke that with black. So we'll say do a stroke, 2 pixels, fine. And then in here, let's go and make another one. So let's grab in here and then Shift, Alt, drag, and grab the size of the iris in there. So it's roughly like that. And then let's stroke that. So stroke, now we can see inside here, if we hide that eye, and let's go and make a new layer inside here that we can just go and fill with, let's say, white. And then sort of zoom into this. You can see the proportions of the iris to the size of the eye. So you can see that if we go and, so let's say, grab, let's say, a regular marquee tool and grab this, you'll notice that the iris is basically, or the eyeball is roughly 3 irises tall. But if you go to this diagram and you look at that, you can see that in this example, that iris is way too big compared to the size of the eyeball. So there's something to be aware of because you don't want to have to deal with fixing it later. So inside here, this little image that I just created is actually something that would be sort of a more useful thing to bring into Maya for creating an eye. So hopefully this has just been helpful to get you to understand how to start. But if we now go into Maya, so let's go inside here, let's make a new scene. And with the new scene, we're going to go in and create an eye. So we could go and use an orthographic image plane, but we'll just sort of do it ourselves. And so the first step is to create a sphere. And so as far as the geometry type to use, you can use NURBS, polys, or sub-Ds, but what we're going to do is we're going to use a NURBS sphere for the outside of the eye, for the basically body of the eye and the cornea, and then for the iris, we're going to end up using a poly torus as our start point. And this is going to have to do with just texturing issues. It's going to be a lot easier to texture your iris if it's a poly object that you can project UVs on, while your NURBS sphere for the eyeball is going to be easy to texture with the UVs because you get you know, sort of texture placement that makes a little more sense. You'll see what I mean later. And so at this point, let's just go and make our NURBS sphere. Let's sort of drag that on here and get started with the eyeball modeling. So with this sphere, let's take it and we're going to just rotate this 90 degrees. And let's also center it. So now it's there. So it's centered from the side view and from the front view. And here's our eye. And with this, going to the side view, again, this is NURBS. And so what that means is that the vertices do not rest on the surface, and we've got this smooth spline shape. And so the first thing we need to do inside here is decide, okay, well, where's that bulge going to be? But before we do that, let's also sort of get the iris inside here to use that as a guide. And so for the iris, what I'm going to do is create a poly torus, because a poly torus kind of works perfectly for creating your iris shape. So let's rotate that 90 degrees and get that centered and then sort of bring that forward a little bit. But with that shape, obviously it's a little heavy, and so we'll just go to the input node, and we don't need so many subdivisions, and so we can lower that down. And then also you have something called section radius when you create a torus that I can go and play with, because obviously this is now our iris, and that's the pupil, the opening. And so inside here, as far as the radius, you know, this is something we can go and change later. And another nice thing about with your iris is having this be an actual opening, meaning there's really a hole there, is that if you want to animate a character's iris, or rather pupil dilating, getting bigger and smaller, in the end you're going to end up being able to sort of scale all the vertices that are inside there by just selecting them, making a cluster, and animating that cluster's scale. And so inside here we'll just sort of, you know, let's say start somewhere like that. Because when you're texturing the eye in the beginning, you don't want to be texturing an eye that's fully dilated, because you're only texturing that part. So you want to texture an eye where the pupil's, you know, a more normal size. So in here, now we've got that inside there. The issue is like, well, how many subdivisions do we need? And do we really need the back? And it's like, well, technically you don't really need the back. Although you do inside here. Let's go and make a couple display layers for a second. So let's say this display layer, I'm going to put the eye, ball, and then on this display layer, I'll put the iris. So let's go and grab the iris, put that on there. So let's call that the iris. So I can just hide the eyeball for a second. So with this thing, since the pupil does have an opening, it does have a little bit of a rounded edge to it. And so we wouldn't want to go and just delete the back half of this and end up with a really sharp edge right there. Because this surface inside here is eventually going to be turned into a sub-D so that it's nice and smooth, and you want to get that nice little highlight right there. So, and then as far as on the poly torus node, the number of subdivisions, you want to have enough divisions inside this thing so that you will be able to animate these vertices for the dilation of the pupil. So where we're at right now at 10 and 10 is actually fine. And so if we look at this from the front view, and take a look at this iris, what we clearly need to do is just flatten this thing because now it looks like a donut. So we're just going to go and do something like that. And so now we basically have our iris shape. So with this, as far as the iris, that's pretty much, where it needs to be as a start point. And so if I go and get my eyeball back, if we now jump to the side view, it becomes the issue of, okay, well, what's the size of this thing overall? And as we pointed out before, we know that the, iris is not, this big compared to the size of the eyeball, although it depends on the animal. So, for example, something like an owl has a much bigger iris relative to the size of the eyeball than a human does, because humans, the irises are a lot smaller. So if you are, doing anything other than a human, you're welcome to experiment. And, things like frogs, for example, like many different animals, whether it's a reptile or an amphibian or a human or a horse, there's lots of different shapes, not only to the size of the iris, but also whether they're convex or concave. And what I mean by that is if I go and take this iris, and let's say we grab some of the vertices on it. So let's go and grab, a bunch of vertices on this thing. And we just go back to the perspective window. Human eyes kind of bulge out a little bit, while certain animals' eyes, actually go in a little bit. And so that's something that there's a little bit of flexibility on based on what you're trying to do as far as a look and also a style. Because there's definitely some cool things you can get when you have a concave eye versus a convex eye. And we'll take a look at examples of that a little later. And so for now, though, it's like, okay, well, we've got this, we've got the eyeball, we just need to pick the size for this thing. And so for that, let's go and scale it down. And then obviously it's going to be forward. But one thing we don't have right now is the bulge. So this is still, obviously, if you look at this height and then you look at the distance from there to the top of the eye, is much bigger than a human iris is. And so really we'd need to go down a little bit. And so, but we're not trying to be anally precise right now, so I'm just going to say, okay, well, that's fine for what we're doing. And so I'm going to decide, all right, well, now where does the iris go? And so the iris goes, relatively forward, but we need to get this bulge now. And so for that, if I go and grab my vertices, I can go and create a bulge, but notice that the bulge is kind of like going all the way back to here, so it's looking more like an egg. And so we need more vertices inside this NURB sphere to get a bulge that's really just in this area. And so since this is a NURB sphere, what we need to do is we need to insert more isoparms into this thing. So I just right click on the NURB sphere, go to isoparm, and decide, well, I'm just going to need more isoparms in this region. So let's say I go and I put one there. And then I just go to surfaces, and then inside here I want to edit NURBS, and I want to insert isoparms. So now I have another one there. So now if I go and grab vertices, you can see I can create a more localized bulge, but we still kind of need more. So let's now go isoparm, and let's select and just create another one in this region. Edit NURBS, insert isoparm, because obviously we need more detail in the front of the eye than the back. So that as you insert these, you're going to be able to start to sort of get an idea of how you're going to be able to create a bulge. So let's go inside here now and be like, all right, well, we're probably going to need another one just inside here. So insert isoparm. And so now if I go and grab these, we can see how that bulge is being created. Go and grab these. And so now that's starting to look a little bit better, although that bulge might be a little bit large relative to the overall size. And so if I go inside here and just hide those vertices for a second, we probably want another one right there. So let's go and insert an isoparm in that region. Insert isoparm. And then grab these. And we can sort of see now that's starting to feel more like the bulge that we would want to have for that region. And so at this point we can look at that and be like, all right, well, bulges aren't huge, obviously. So it's just a little bit of a bulge that we're going to get on that eye. So something like that is pretty close to what we want. And then for the iris position, that's pretty much going to be in this area. So now that we have the iris and we have the sphere, there's a couple things that we're going to need to do. Because clearly the iris right now has a gap between it and the body of the eye. And if we go back to Photoshop for a second, and take a look at our diagram, you can see what's going on with an iris. So you can see that it does kind of bulge out a little bit and kind of bend in towards the cornea. But one thing that is obviously going on in a real eye that we're not dealing with is that a real eye has thickness to the cornea. And so inside here what we're going to do is just going to take our iris and just get it to sort of go up towards that edge right there. And so going into Maya, to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my iris right now, which is a poly surface, and let's just turn it into a sub D. So I'm just going to go to modify, convert poly to sub D, or I'll just use a button that I have on the shelf to do that. And so now that I've done that, I can see that it sort of changed the size a little bit as far as the, we can see that the smoothing of it made it, feel a little smaller. So we can see the relative change from being a poly to being a sub D. So that's why, since we know this thing's going to become a sub D in the end, we want to work with it as a sub D right now to make sure the scale is correct. So now I can go in here and be like, all right, well, so that's going to be a little bit bigger. And then for the vertices inside here, I need to go in and decide how I want to deal with any kind of bulging. So first of all, inside here, as far as the thickness of this thing, I could even go and make this a little bit thinner. So I'm going to grab this, scale it down a little bit this way. Then inside here, I'm going to go and grab vertices. And so if I go in and start grabbing, let's say, these vertices here, and obviously I could just sort of select edge loops, but for now that's not that many points, so it's simple enough. I can go and take this and sort of pull that in a little bit, because there is a little bit of a ridge on the edge of the pupil that kind of goes out and then back in. And so that's what I just put right there. And then going to the front view, I can now just sort of grab those interior points and then go to the perspective view and get shading on and decide, do I want a concave eye or do I want a convex eye? And so inside here, just to illustrate the some of the things we're going to be doing later, we're going to do one that's actually a little bit more concave, meaning going in. And so now I'm going to go in. Let's sort of grab the next points out. And then once we have these, we'll decide where we want those to go. So let's just go into this view. And so we could get the whole thing sort of be concave. But we want it at its edges to, kind of go out towards the cornea like we saw in that diagram. So we can kind of leave these there and then go to the next one out. So let's go and grab these. And so I'm just sort of grabbing these points. And so for these, what we're going to want to do is sort of scale these out a little bit, because these are the ones that are going to kind of be going once we get the iris or the eyeball back. These are the ones that are going to kind of go and scale themselves towards that edge right there. So that we know that we're sort of going to eventually not see that edge right there, but the whole thing is kind of going out. So at this point inside here, this is pretty much what we need for our iris shape. And then the back we're not really concerned with, really just the front. And then down here in this region, like this still could be a little bit thinner than it is. So in the front view, we'll just go and grab these. So lots of these things with your iris, once you sort of get to your final shaders and stuff, you're going to end up tweaking even more. We're just trying to sort of block things out. So let's grab this. Let's just make that a little bit thinner. Okay. So we've got an iris inside here. And we've got our eyeball. And so obviously it would be a good time to just sort of save where we're at. Let's turn on wireframe on shaded. So let's go and save this out. So let's just call this, new eye 1. And at this point, we're ready to kind of block out our shaders for this thing. And so we don't necessarily need to worry about the UVs just yet or texturing. And so what we're going to do is let's take our eye. So we've got these two surfaces. Let's group them together so they act as one. So their pivot point is now at the origin. And then I'm just going to move this up, just sit it on the grid. So there's our eye. And we'll just call this our eye. And then now let's sort of block out some shader stuff on it. So the first thing is obviously on this outside surface, this thing's going to need to have transparency on it. And so this is where we're going to need to sort of block things out using IPR. And so let's go to Hypershade. And we're going to basically need two shaders, one for the eyeball and one for the iris. So I'm going to make two blend shaders. Now, a iris is not very specular, and obviously the cornea and the outside of the eye is, so these are just going to have very different specular settings. And so inside here, I'll just go and say that maybe this blend will be my, let's say, iris. And then this blend right here, let's say, is just the eyeball. And we'll get those assigned. And so let's just go into wireframe mode. Let's select the iris and give it that shader, and let's give the body and give it that shader. And then to block things out real quick, we know that an eyeball is very, very shiny because it's wet and it's very smooth. And so as a result of that, it's going to have a tight highlight on it, meaning that if it's illuminated by a hard, small light source, it's going to reflect that as a hard, small light source. And so this is a shiny material. Then as far as specular color, eyeballs reflect basically light based on the color of the light source, meaning a white light would make a white highlight, a blue light would make a blue highlight. So you want to leave this at white, and you want that specular color to be very, very high, because an eye will reflect, as far as value, most of the light that's hitting it in a highlight. And then as far as reflectivity goes, eyes are definitely reflective, but not nearly that much. And so we're going to lower that to about 0.15 as a start point. So that's our eyeball kind of blocked out. And then for the iris inside here, these do not need to be reflective. And the specular color inside here and the eccentricity, a iris is not very shiny compared to the eyeball. And so we obviously would not have a tight eccentricity. We'll spread that highlight out, but then it also doesn't reflect quite as much light. So we'll lower the specular color. Although this right here really depends on the animal. So for example, human irises do not reflect a lot of light, but something like a frog's iris, for example, is actually rather shiny and rather reflective. And so there's actually some very cool looks you can get with your eyes if you do actually have inside here some specular color if you're doing something other than a human eye, especially if you colorize it, meaning that you'll find that with certain animals or reptiles or whatever, that it actually, the specular color is not necessarily the color of the light source. So you might actually get, for example, like a warm highlight or a green or a cool highlight based on what's going on with the color of the iris. But right now we'll just leave it with a 0 saturation and relatively low as far as the specular color. So now we've blocked out our iris, we've blocked out our eyeball. And then for now, just so it's easier to see the iris, let's just put a color. We'll deal with textures and texturing later, but for now, let's just go and give it some color. So let's just say we're going to go and give it a little bit of color so we can see this thing, so we can differentiate it. And so we've got the iris, we've got the eyeball blocked out. We'll deal with textures later. And now on this guy, the eyeball, the corneal bulge inside here, meaning this little bulge, needs to be transparent. And so what that means is we need a transparency map for the eyeball. And so going to its shader, and let me just delete history in the scene right now because I don't need it. So let's delete all history. Let's grab this. Let's go to our eyeball shader. And on this, we're going to go to transparency, and we're going to texture that. And what we're going to texture it with is a ramp. So if I go out here now and I hit, 4, 5, 6 is going to display textures, but since this ramp is on transparency, it's not going to show it in hardware because by default hardware just wants to show your color map. So I'll just go on the shader to hardware texturing and tell it to show me my transparency map. Now with that visible, I can just block it out because I can now go to the transparency map, and what do I want to do? Well, right now you can see the texture. Since this is a NURBS eye, I don't need to lay out UVs on it, meaning it's got inherent UVs, and I can see that this texture is going this way, but I want to switch it to a U ramp, so it actually goes this way. Because now, obviously, this back part that's red is not transparent, and then this blue part up here is transparent. And then I'm just going to go inside here. I'm going to use smooth interpolation. You get a nicer result. When you use linear, which is a default, you get this kind of noticeable edge where it starts to fade from black to white. But if you use smooth, you don't get that. It's a lot softer. So it's always pretty much always a good idea to change it from linear to smooth. So what do I need to do now? Well, where is it going to be transparent? Well, obviously, right now, it's going to be transparent sort of in that region. But the texture is being displayed a little bit, not very high resolution right now. So let's go back to our shader. So we're going to go to the eyeball shader. We're going to go down to hardware texturing. It's set to transparency, but we're going to set the resolution, let's say, to high quality. So it just looks a little bit better. And then now when I go out here and go to my transparency map, now we need to bring up a very important point about what's going on inside here. As far as how to figure out what to do, because you don't do this, meaning you don't create a super, super hard point where it goes from being opaque to being transparent. It really needs to be a soft area. And so to illustrate that, we want to just sort of jump to Photoshop for a second. All right, so let's just go in here, and what I want to do is, let's just get that out of the way, and open examples of eyes. Let's say, for example, something like this, or this is a good image in here, is you can see that the transition from the body of the eye to the cornea is not a hard line. And with this line inside here, you can see that it's got this sort of soft gradation where it's basically going from opaque into transparent in the corneal region. And that's really important because the combination of that transparency creates a sort of soft shadow edge around the perimeter of the iris. And so if you look in there, for example, you can tell that we're kind of looking into the region where the iris goes down behind the body of the eye. And so this darkness that we often associate with the sort of rim of the iris is something that comes from two things. One is there are irises definitely where in the color it gets darker at the edge, and then on top of that you'll find that there's actually a shadow going on in here. And so since the light in this image is coming from, let's just sort of zoom in a little bit, since the light's coming from the right, you can see that in here we have sort of a little bit of a shadow coming from this object, and then on the left side the darkness is actually because since this iris bulges out, basically we have surface shading going on there. So this is shading, while in this region that's kind of like shadow. And so by creating a eye this way, where you have the corneal transparency fading with a ramp into the body of the eye, when you ray trace, since transparent objects can cast accurate shadows via ray tracing, and actually in Mental Ray there is an option now for depth map shadows to be able to do that as well. You can actually get this darkness at the perimeter of the iris by a shadow calculation, and it's going to make your eyes look a lot more natural. So let's jump back to Maya. And so now inside here, as far as figuring out, exactly where we need to go and put this and what it should be, it's going to be a little bit easier to preview this by actually going in and doing a render. And so what I'm going to do is say, we'll sort of start with that, but going into our render settings, and let me just sort of get this shrunk down a little bit. We're going to render with Mental Ray, so I'll just switch to Mental Ray. And inside here, 640 by 480 is the default, but let's just make that a little smaller. And we don't need our anti-aliasing up, but we definitely want ray tracing on inside there. And with that, I'm also going to create a light. And so the light I'm going to use for this to start, we'll just create a directional light. Hit 7 so we can kind of see where that highlight's going to pop up. And so I want the highlight to pop up in sort of this region, so I'm kind of putting that around there. And then for my light, I'm going to go to shadows and I'm going to turn on ray trace shadows. And with the ray trace shadows with this light, by default, the light angle is 0, which means that you're going to get razor sharp shadow edges. And so this is what you would call a hard light. And so we'll soften it down later. But as you increase the light angle, which is going to give you softer shadows, the soft shadows are going to look very noisy or grainy, and then you have to raise this attribute to fix that, and that slows down render time. So for now we'll just use hard shadows as we block things out. And for the light, we'll just leave everything to default as far as color and intensity. And now we can do a quick render, but let me also just get my resolution gate up so I can sort of see what's going to render inside here. And let's just get that eye kind of centered. And also, since we're going to be rendering an eye for all of this, which is round, let's just actually go and switch real quick, and let's just do a square rendering. So let's just go and say 500 by 500. So we're going to render square. And then also, the camera, the default camera in Maya, has a focal length that's only 35, which means that you get a lot of perspective distortion. And so I'm just going to, let's say, make my focal length a little longer, and so it doesn't quite distort my geometry since I'm relatively close to it. And so now at this point I can go in and do a test render. Now for this, if I do a regular render, it's going to calculate the ray trace shadow. If I do a IPR render, it won't. And so now inside here we can see that ray trace render. And so what we need to do is, now you can see the transparency. We're able to see that iris that's inside there. But we're going to do a couple things inside here to block things out a little better. Let's just use IPR. The shadow is going to go away because IPR doesn't support ray trace shadows. So now it looks like this. And inside here I'm going to take the body of the eye, my eyeball, which right now is a dark gray. Let's just marquee drag a little region inside here, and let's just make it a lot lighter. So it's a little bit more towards a eye color. And then inside here, let's go to our transparency map. And with IPR, we can see that if, for example, I pull this up and pull this up, we can see it's previewing where that transparency is. So we're seeing a little bit of a change in our highlight because of the bulge that's on the eye. But we also now can very, very quickly, and let's just go and say marquee drag this whole region, so that we can go and figure out where we want to have that transition. So you can see that if I make a very hard edge inside here, what that's going to look like. And so let's go and actually bring this down a little bit. And let's go and bring this up a little bit. And so I'm going to now scoot it around. So you just kind of scoot it so that basically you're getting that transition. So you can see that by creating this concave eye that goes in, you can see that you're going to get a lot more shading inside there. And so also on the left here, because of where the transparency is, you can see that the edge of that object is visible. And so what we're going to want to do inside here is tweak that geometry so it's closer to the body of the eye, so that we basically are able to get a nice soft transition all the way around. And so if I went, for example, and drag this up even more, I'd eventually be able to get it to that point. But the problem is that if I do that too much, now our iris is kind of going away. And so what we're going to do is just to sort of go back here so that we know that this is generally in the vicinity that we're going to want as far as that transition. And then the thickness of that transition inside here, we can see that, right now we can make it, a little bit thinner, something like that. And if we now did a regular render, you can see that the darkness inside there is coming from a shadow that's being cast by this edge. And so when we have a sort of a high frontal 3/4 light, we're going to get a rendering in the iris that's going to be dark in this region and light on the bottom. And so now if we go in and start playing with our geometry, and let's go in, for example, let's just sort of take a different view of what's going on inside here. So let's get a little bit more frontal on this eye, so we can observe this a little bit better. And so we can see that we have that nice soft transition there from opaque to transparent. We can see the shadow that's being created as a result of this light source that's inside there. And so let's go now and make a couple tweaks. And let me also go to my render view for a second, and let's sort of save this image just so that we can go and make comparisons to our progress. I do that a lot, is just sort of keep image to sort of see if we're moving along and to compare changes that we make. So we now need to tweak our iris a little bit. And so what I'm going to do is on my eyeball layer, I could hide it, but instead of that, I want to kind of go into shaded mode. So I'll take the eyeball and just template it so I can still kind of see the wireframe inside there. So for this surface, we can see, if we look from this angle, we can see that gap between the iris and the body of the eye. And so that's what we want to work on. And so to do that, I could obviously sort of scale the whole iris, but then if I go to the side view, I'm making my iris, bigger. And so since we only are going to see a certain part of it, we're going to go and grab let's say, some edges inside here so that we can do what we need to do to sort of scale that outer region. So we're kind of keeping the part of the eye that we're seeing inside here at the same scale. And then from this perspective, I can go in and scale it so there's less of a gap between these two surfaces right there. Also, I could choose to, bend this out a little bit if I wanted to control the shading that we're getting. And so obviously the shape of this is going to have a huge effect on the overall look of the style of iris you're trying to create. And so, but now that I've minimized that gap, and I can go and do that a little bit more, changing the shape of the iris at this point on is obviously very easy because it's just a matter of moving edges, or moving vertices forward or backwards. So if you want a more human eye, you're going to take this and sort of bulge it out. And so let's go in and do that. Let's just go and grab some of these edges. Actually, let's go out one more. So I'm just going to shift control drag so I can add to my selection. And I'm missing those. So I've got these edges. So I can now scoot this whole thing forward a little bit. So if I bring it out like this, obviously it's going back too quickly. So I'm going to have to bring the next edge out a little bit. And so at this point, we'll just sort of bring that out like so. Go to the front view. And then now let's go and grab that next row of edges. Go to the perspective view. And let's scoot that out a little bit. So now we can see we have an eye that's bulging out. And so we can go and play with that. We can go and play with the scale of that to control how that's looking. And so then inside here, maybe I'll decide that these edges, so let's go to the front view, grab these. And this stuff, you don't really need to get precise because it's so easy to change at any point. But since the placement of these edges, so I'm just scooting that in a little bit, is going to have an effect once I project my planar UVs onto the surface. I want to get their relative position as far as scale relatively correct right now before I start to texture it. So at this point, if we now take a look and untemplate our eyeball, and then let's just go and get rid of those on our sub D. Let's go and actually just get rid of the edge display. And so let's just go into standard, get the eyeball on, go back to here. And I want to save this view of my eye, by the way, so I'm just going to say select my camera. And I could do a bookmark or something, but something I like to do is just set a key on the camera, because then if I move the camera around, I can just go back to frame one. Easier than navigating through bookmarks and all that kind of stuff. So now we can go in and do another render. And so open the render view window. This is where we were. Now we do a render. And we'll see that the shading has changed dramatically inside there as a result of changing the shape. And so now instead of getting this very large sort of gradient inside there, where if you have light that's coming from the upper right, the bottom of the iris is brighter than the top by a lot, which is a look that you'll find in certain eyes or certain styles for rendering eyes. Then in this one, we have something a little more normal, where we're getting that shadow being cast with a ray trace shadow, but we're also getting shading on the other edge. And then the gradient right there from opaque to transparent is working pretty well. And so at this point, what we have going on, and let's go and take a look at this from the side, is we can see that we're not sort of seeing into the eye as we were before, as far as that little gap between the iris and the body. And so we've resolved that, so it's clean. So what we're looking at there is something is that, that's looking like a normal eye. And let's just go in from this point, get this inside here, do a render. And for what we're going to be doing next, because at this point, now that we have the geometry blocked out and we have our transparency blocked out for the body, the next thing to do is to basically go in and start dealing with our shaders, meaning the shader for the body of the eye and the shader for the iris, and then texturing them as well. Because something like a eye is a translucent surface, meaning light gets absorbed into it. And so we're going to expect the dark side of this eye to be a little lighter than it is right now, even with the light coming from the upper right. So we're going to use something that's like translucency or subsurface scattering to be able to do that. But there's a attribute on regular shaders now in Maya that we can use to simulate subsurface scattering with mental ray that works really well. So we'll take a look at that. And so at this point, what I'm also going to do to make it easier to see what's going on in my scene, just to block things out, is I'm just going to put a little, ground plane underneath this. So let's go and create a little plane, stick it on here, sort of scale that up a little bit. Let me just sort of center that, just so we can get a little cast shadow from this eye, just so we can see, it's going to make it a little bit easier to read what's going on. And also, since eyes are reflective, when we design the reflectivity of the eye, we need something for it to reflect. So that's kind of the main reason why I'm going to put some geometry inside here. And then let's also go and take this and get a couple. And so let's say we'll rotate that 90 degrees. And so that we have basically like a wall right there that we'll scoot up. And then we'll make another one. And we'll rotate that 90 degrees and stick that back over here. And so at this point, let me just do that from the top view, make it a little bit quicker. And let's scale that out. And so there we go. So now I've got those two surfaces and this surface down here for my eye as reflections. And also inside here I might want to throw a quick texture on those so the reflections are easier to see. But if we just go back to our view that we saved on our eye, and let's pull back so we're not quite so close on that. So let's say we have a little bit more room. Select my camera, save this new position. Let's now go and do a render. But there's no shaders on those geometry other than just a default Lambert shader. So I'm going to create a shader that I'm going to put on those surfaces. And so I'm going to go and select these three surfaces. I'm going to assign this new shader that I created. And that shader by default is going to have reflectivity. I don't need reflectivity on the floor or these walls. It's the eye that needs to be reflective. And so I'm just going to go and get them so they're not super shiny and maybe, a little bit darker. And now we can go and do another render. And let's go and save our scene, bring this up, and now render. So now we can clearly see the reflectivity that's on this shader. And so hopefully it's clear why I needed to put a little bit of geometry inside here. And also you can take a little look right down there to see, because of ray tracing, how the body of the eye creates a black shadow, but the cornea creates a shadow that's allowing a little bit of light to go through. Although once we turn refractions on for the cornea, that'll end up being relatively black. So now we're at a good place as far as where our light is in our scene. To be able to sort of preview what's going on inside here as far as reflections, where specular highlights are showing up, what they look like, that sort of shadow edge, that where we transition from the body into the iris, the fact that we're getting this sort of highlight right there because it is a rounded surface right there, although it could be a little bit thinner because the highlight wouldn't necessarily be that strong. We have geometry to be reflecting, to be able to evaluate what the reflectivity of the eye should be. So it's kind of like a good setup that we have to move on into shaders and texturing. And so that'll be the next thing we're going to do. And for this, as far as whether we deal with the eye or we deal with the iris first, it doesn't necessarily matter. And so let's say that we're probably going to go in and just deal with the iris first, because the iris is actually very straightforward to texture. And to do that, we're going to end up needing to lay the UVs out for it, because we are dealing with a sub-D. And so we're going to take the sub-D, convert it to polys, and then do the UVs. So let's do that next.